Good morning. You might grab your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 5. That's where we will start together this morning. And it is a delight to see you and glad that you're here with us. And hope that this time together, first of all, helps orient your heart towards God. And as Brother Creighton may mention in the prayer, that we take this time seriously and praise and honor God, and that we help each other think about that. But also we hope that it's an encouragement to you and edifying. And if there's anything that I say that doesn't make sense or you don't think lines up with Scripture, I'd be happy to talk to you about that for as long as we can that's profitable. And if you have questions about why we say and do the things we do, we'd be really glad to talk about that and try to make our case from the Scriptures about why we do what we do and why we say the things we say. So a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to talk to you all about cultivating our character. And that kind of came from some thoughts that I was having about living in a world that often talks about character and developing that, but doesn't really tell us why or how to do that in the most fundamental way. It's interesting. I was listening on the radio after I had preached that lesson, and Elton John was doing an ad on the radio about developing love and humility and kindness. Now, I don't know a lot about Elton John. I know enough to say I'm all about developing love and humility and kindness as well. But I think Mr. Elton John and I would go in very different directions about why we would do that. And the reason that I want to cultivate that character is, as I talked about, I want to develop love and humility and kindness because I see the instructions, the commands of my God. And because I see what God said is that we are all created in the image of God. And that's why I want to treat others with love and kindness. And that I see the character of God, and particularly in Jesus, I see his humility. So when we talk about cultivating character, the world still uses that language of character and calling us to high levels of morality. But then I think we're missing the foundation in our world, and we don't need to let go of that so we really see what it means to develop good character. What I want to talk about this morning is putting our character on display. And that is, we live lives that I hope are different from the world, and we live in ways that are distinctive, and we need to be ready to put that on display, to make that we know that we're different from the world, and to not be embarrassed by that. And if we have that good foundation in place, if we see the commands and the creation and the character of God, if we embrace that well, then we will be distinctive. We will be different from the world, and we need to be willing to embrace that. So, of course, I've had you turn to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, which maybe is one of the most well-known passages, not just among believers, but among the world that the Scriptures teach about, I really think about our character being on display in powerful ways. So let's look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. There Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out, to be trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." This is a familiar text. And in the first place, disciples are called salt. You are the salt of the earth. And it seems to me that one of the emphases of salt is that it has a preservative nature. That you can put it on meat and keep it from rotting. And there is a way in which disciples are supposed to be kind of preserving what is good about society, that we are sprinkled throughout the world and we kind of hold things where they ought to be. At least that's the goal. And you think about, well, how is it that disciples are to be distinctive? How is it that they're going to be different from the world around them? Because if salt is not distinctive, if salt is not different from what it's around, then it's not really effective at all, is it? If you lose your saltiness, if the salt has lost its flavor, Jesus says, then it's not good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. That is, if salt is contaminated with the rot of the meat, or if salt is toned down by the flavor of the things that are around it, salt's not doing anything. And it might be good to throw out on the road and walk over. but it's not good for anything that we would really want to use it for. How is it that we are called to be distinctive? I really think Jesus gives the answer in the first 10 or 12 verses there. Because what he's saying is you're supposed to be distinctive so that you can be a blessing to the world, so that you can be salt to the earth. And I think the point is because of what you are, you can receive the blessing of God. And so we are able then to be a blessing to the world. And what does he call us to be? Well, it calls us to be poor in spirit. That's utter humility, isn't it? We recognize that in and of ourselves, we are not all that we ought to be. And so we mourn over our sin, and we are lowly. We're meek. And not only that, but we hunger and thirst for righteousness. And because of that, we show mercy, and we are pure in heart. That is, we're the same through and through. We're not hypocrites. We're not putting on a show. We're not just something on the outside and something different on the inside. We're peacemakers and willing even to suffer persecution, which I'll talk about in just a second a little more. But just think about that. If you are a person who is merciful in search of mercy, if you're a person who's a peacemaker so that you can be called a child of God, if you're a person who's pure in heart, you're the same inside and out. Nobody has to guess where you stand on things. You're not trying to fool anybody. If you're somebody who is lowly, if you're somebody who's longing and hungry and thirsting for righteousness, that makes you pretty salty, doesn't it? You're pretty distinctive from the world around you. And so I think we can read those Beatitudes, we can read those blessing passages and say, I want to receive the blessing of God. If I'm going to receive the blessing of God, that's going to call me to be a different person all the way through. And then I can be a blessing to the people who are around me. Then I can be salt to the earth. And so he develops that idea even more in verse 14, and he changes the image. Not just salt, though I think that salt image is pretty powerful, but he says you are the light of the world. And so that word you there is the plural word you. So in our modern English, we don't really have a plural you, but in the South we do. We have y'all. I think he's saying y'all are the light of the world. Now, it may just be since he's talking to a crowd, but it's interesting to me. He says, y'all are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. I think there's something to the collective in the way that we are able to be lights to the world. I think it's something about the way that we work together that can serve as a light to the world. So we sing the song, ye are the light of the world. I thought ye was just the old-fashioned way of saying you, and it kind of is, but it was the old-fashioned way of saying y'all. It was so the song now in this book, oh, Christians, do not hide your light, for ye are the light of the world. It's talking to a group and not just an individual. And so when he calls his disciples to be light and says that they are light, I think he's saying that in the way that they interact and deal with each other as they're guided by the words of Jesus, that there's something about, and I think maybe we can apply it to here, there's something about this community, this family, as we work together that serves as a city set on a hill. It's interesting when the Pilgrims came to start, well, really the Puritans after the Pilgrims, but when they came, one of their preachers said that what they wanted to do in building the city that was going to be in Massachusetts, that they wanted to be the light of the world. And I think maybe he had some biblical concept of what that was supposed to be, but he wanted it to be a city, like a literal city that was set on a hill that the world would look at and say, they've got it figured out. But I think that we're talking about maybe local congregations and disciples as we work together and as we look for opportunities even to help those across the world. We may say something more about that as we go. But we understand the purpose of light, and Jesus explains it for us here, that the purpose of light is to give darkness. There's no point, Jesus says, in lighting a lamp and then hiding it. But the very point of having a lamp, the very point of being a light, is so that you would put yourself on a lampstand for other people to see it. Now, why would you not want people to see it? What does he say in verses 10 through 12? In those Beatitudes, he says, blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Could you imagine? Here you are, you're trying to be merciful and you hunger and thirst for righteousness and you want to be a peacemaker. And then all of a sudden you hear this stuff about persecution. It's like, I'll be all those things, but I'll try to keep it on the down low. right? I'll try to make it not so apparent that I'm trying to be different. I don't want to stand out that much, because do you know what that would mean for me at work? Do you know what that would mean for me at school? Do you know how different I would be and how much attention that would bring and the danger that is? And Jesus says, yes, I do understand that. You are going to be persecuted. You are going to have evil things said about you. You are going to be cut off, but blessed are you. And in fact, I think Jesus takes a step further here and says, not only are you blessed in being the persecuted, but let's go ahead and put that on a lampstand so that everybody can see your mercy and your peacemaking and your lowliness and your hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And even in your persecution, put that on the lampstand so that the world can see and that you can be a light to the world. And so the call comes to the disciples. Let your light shine. You live in a way so that other people see the good works you're involved in. Y'all are the light of the world, Jesus says, so you need to shine in a way that people are given sight by the way that you live. Your steps, your life, your words, your thoughts, your actions need to shine in such a way that the rest of the world sees something by the way you're living that gives light to their darkness. And so the goal of our light shining, the aim of being on a lampstand, the purpose of other people seeing our good works, Jesus says, is that God the Father, who is in heaven, will be glorified. I think this is significant when we talk about letting our light so shine. We should live in such a way that the world sees that we are guided and that we are shaped by something beyond the world. We are shaped by something bigger than tradition or the culture. We are shaped by the God, our Father. And so He gets the credit. He's magnified. He's praised. He gets honored when people see the way that we, Jesus' disciples, live. Let's flip over to Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, and we'll pick up at verse 12, and Paul says something very similar, echoing the words of Jesus here. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, Paul says, "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to boast, because I did not run in vain or labor in vain." Now in this text, Paul commends the Philippians for their faithful obedience. You see that in verse 12, he says that you have always obeyed, not just when I was there, but even when I wasn't. And so it's not as if the Philippians are not what they ought to be. They are already commended for being faithfully obedient, but he's calling them to something higher. He's calling them to a higher way of living. He says they need to continue to work out their salvation. They don't need to let up with their faithfulness to which they have been called. They need to work with fear and trembling, recognizing the stakes of their obedience. In fact, notice in verse 13, he says, God is working in you. As they work out their salvation, God is able to use them for His will and for His work. He's able to accomplish His purposes through people who are committed to faithfulness, whether Paul's there or not. And I think verse 14 is key. They were to do this. They were to do everything. They were to do all things without grumbling or disputing. As they serve the Lord, they needed to have an attitude of joy and contentment. And that'll be one of the key points we make in just a little bit. Here's what He wants to use them, and I will say, here's what He wants to use us for. He wanted blameless and innocent children who could, in the middle of a crooked and perverse generation, a bent and twisted world, could shine as lights. If you have a footnote there, it might show you that what Paul is saying, like stars, like luminaries. So you think about the darker that the world gets. I like the fact that I don't live in town anymore. And so I can look up at night and see stars. I can see lots of them. The darker that it gets, the brighter those luminaries, the brighter those stars shine. They are like lights. And he's saying that in this crooked and perverse generation, as he looks around at the world, he says, you who are innocent and blameless, you who do all things without grumbling and disputing, you who are working out your own salvation, you can shine like lights in a crooked and perverse generation. I want to say this. Paul looks at his world and he calls it crooked and perverse. We're talking about 2,000 years ago. Paul looks around at the world and says, this place is twisted and perverted and wicked and bent in all sorts of wrong ways. What would he say about ours? I think he'd probably say something pretty similar, don't you? People have misdirected goals and aims and desires and loves and passions. But I do want to make a point here, that I think sometimes people think that the Bible just wants us to follow old-fashioned ways. And that when we talk about following the Bible, we're just calling people back to the way people used to live, right? That we're calling them back to first century standards or something like that. I want to tell you that we're not being called to just be old-fashioned. We're not being called to just follow the first century ways. We're being called to follow God's ways. Because Paul looked around at the first century world and said that the standard he was calling to people, to which he was calling people, was very different than the standard of the world even 2,000 years ago. So I don't want to be a disciple who just looks like people did in the 1950s. I don't want to be a disciple who just looks like somebody did in the 1400s. I don't want to look like people in the year 50 or so, year 60 when Paul's writing this. I want to look like God wants me to look. And so when we talk about marriage, for example, I think the world looks at what we say about marriage and they just say, that's just the old-fashioned way. Now, the way we want to talk about marriage is the real old-fashioned way. In the beginning. That's how old-fashioned I want to be. When we talk about the modern pursuit for wealth and for gain and for money, I think the world looks at us and say, y'all are just being old-fashioned sticks in the mud. I want to be more than old-fashioned. I want to be shaped by God. And so he would look at Paul could look at the world around him and say it's crooked and perverse. Every age in some ways crooked and perverse. And we're living in a moment where we are able to see that more, but we have always needed to shine as lights and luminaries. We've always been called to be distinctive from the world around us. And so my point is that the words of Jesus and the apostles called people in every age to be different from the wicked world they lived in. They were calling people to a higher and different standard. Their words were not intended to match the culture that they were in, but to call them to be lights in the midst of wicked darkness. Now, in order to do that, you can look there at verse 16. They needed to hold on tight to the word of life, which of course would be the instructions that they had been given. If they would do that, Paul would have reason to celebrate, even to boast, because it would mean that he didn't waste his time in Philippi. In other words, instead, it had been time well spent. All right, let's flip over to one more passage. These are my three main points, is just looking at these three passages and considering them. Flip over to 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. In that passage, Peter says, you are a chosen family, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul, by keeping your conduct excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good works, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. You can hear Peter echoing the words of Jesus there, can't you? So the first thing he says about them in this paragraph that we looked at is he explains who the people are that he's writing to, who the disciples of Jesus are. They are chosen. They are distinct. They have been called out of the darkness of the world, and they have been called into his marvelous light. People who once were nothing special, right? Folks who were just ordinary people. They were not a special people, have now been called to be the unique people of God. The folks who had not received mercy now have received the mercy that comes from God. And in view of that, in view of them they were not a people at one time and now they are God's people, he says, you are sojourners and aliens. Different translations may render that sojourners and aliens different. Sometimes say exiles or pilgrims. But just think about that idea of being a sojourner or a pilgrim, an exile. Followers of Jesus shouldn't consider the world in which they live. They shouldn't consider their physical address to be their primary residency. You're a sojourner. You're a pilgrim. You're just here for a period of time, and you're not ultimately a resident of this world. And because we have that wanderer status, because we have that temporary residency here, wanderers, disciples, sojourners, and exiles need to keep their conduct different than the conduct of the world around them. He says it's more than just participating in the things that the world does. He says it's a war being waged. As sojourners and exiles, people who are not from here, there is an attack from the world. There's an attack from Satan. There are fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. And we want to stay away from those because our soul is at stake. Our soul is at stake. But just abstaining from it for our soul's sake takes us to a different level because the world is going to accuse us of all sorts of evil things. And we see that in the world. You try to be a faithful disciple, and you may very well get accused of being a bigot or unloving or hateful. And you're going to have all this slander spoken about you because you want to maintain the standard that God reveals in His Word. And what Peter says here is we want to live in such a way so that even when the Gentiles slander us, which the world seems desirous to do, that we can live in such a way that they, because of your good works, could be shifted from slandering you to glorifying God. Wouldn't that be a powerful transition? Here's somebody who is slandering you because of your beliefs, your actions, and they, in actually seeing the way that you live, say, I was wrong about that. And they go from slandering you to glorifying God in the day of visitation. I don't have an answer exactly for why that just did that. That's not what I was going to say, but I don't know what it is. That's okay. I'm going to cut that off so it's not blinding. I think that may have cut loose, but I'll work on it later. All right. I don't think, let me get where I was saying. The day of visitation. Maybe that's the day of judgment, but maybe it's a day that they come to acknowledge who God is. There are different ideas about what the day of visitation is. Regardless, what Peter says here is that your life can lead them from slandering you to glorifying God. So you're called to be a disciple of Jesus. That's what you're called to. So I want to note a few things as we begin to focus in. We are not trying to draw attention to ourselves for ourselves. That's an important note to make. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, Jesus tells the people who are listening there, speaking specifically to the disciples, he says, beware of doing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. And then he will talk about praying. He'll talk about fasting. He'll talk about almsgiving, that is sharing with those who are in need. And he talks about people who would do that with the intention of being seen by the world. Now, if you're reading that, you may say, wait a second. Didn't he just say, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven? And then here in chapter 6, he says, don't do your righteousness before men. And he tells them to go in a closet to pray and to wash their face when they fast. And don't tell anybody about your almsgiving. Even your right hand's not supposed to know what your left hand is doing. And I would say this. I would say that what Jesus is warning about is not somebody seeing what you're doing. He's warning about you doing it so that people will see it and honor you and glorify you. If we're doing it and people see it, that's all right. And if we're doing it and people see it and we're doing it so that they will honor God, that's even better. But if we're doing it so that we get the glory for it, that's when the problem sets in. I will say the reason that I take that is, one, because of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. There has to be some way to balance out what chapter 5 and chapter 6 say. But we also have reports through the scriptures of people doing good for other people, of people praying, of people fasting, and they're being commended for that. And it's not something bad that they accidentally let somebody see, and it's not even bad that they did it out in public. The bad thing would be is if they were seeking the glory for it, when ultimately the Lord should receive glory for it. Just think about the Corinthians that Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. They're poor and they're giving out of their poverty to help the needy who are in Judea and Jerusalem. They don't hide that so much that nobody knows about it. And Paul doesn't hide it so nobody else finds about it. He writes a letter about it so that every Christian who reads 2 Corinthians 8 knows about it. And so why? Well, they had first given themselves to the Lord. That's where the devotion is. We read about disciples praying and fasting. Well, what does that teach us? We actually learn from those good examples about the seriousness of the work that they were involved in, praying and fasting. So, doing good, praying, fasting can be seen by others, and our goal can actually be to let other people see that. But we don't want the glory for ourselves. We want to put ourselves on a lampstand so that the world will see our good works and be driven to glorify our Father who is in heaven. So, the aim is that they give God the glory and credit for the way that He could use us. So we want to develop a heart that wants God to get the glory and not me. And that's the great challenge that sometimes we have to wrestle with. Let me say this as well. The passages that we read, especially Matthew chapter 5 and 1 Peter chapter 2, talk about people by our life being driven to glorify God. And that's a wonderful objective. And that's an ideal finish. But that's not the way everybody's going to respond. In chapter 5 of Matthew, verses 10 through 12, he talks about us being persecuted. He talks about us being rejected. Over in 1 Peter, this is a good passage to look at, I think, because really all of the end of 1 Peter is about enduring through suffering. Well, why does that suffering come? Well, because they're living distinctive lives and the people are not responding by glorifying God. They're responding by hurting God's people even worse. And in 1 Peter chapter 4, he says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to no longer live the rest of the time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have worked out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them in the same excess of dissipation, maligning you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So your life is going to change and the world is going to notice. And friends at first will wonder why you're not doing this. They will be surprised that you don't run with them into the same paths of sin that you used to run with them in. They will be surprised by that. And then it will go from surprise to maligning. And Peter talks all through 1 Peter chapter 2, 3, 4. He talks about suffering at the hands of evil and ungodly men. And he'll say things like it's better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. So it may cost you opportunities. You may have to walk away from relationships, and it may cost you even physical suffering. What challenges do you need to be prepared for when you make a commitment to put your character on display? I can't even imagine all the ways. Some of you have had to pay a high cost for that. Some of you have had to walk away from family. Some of you have had to lose opportunities that could have been available to you. But notice what Peter says. In verse 5, he says, but they will give an account to him who will judge the living and the dead. You have an option there. You could trade that. You could go back with them on those paths, but you don't want to trade places because they're going to stand before judgment. And whose judgment do you want to receive a positive evaluation in? Do you want the positive evaluation of the friends who are surprised and then maligning you? Or do you want the positive evaluation of the one who's going to judge the living and the dead? You're going a different route than they are. And it may result in persecution, but you don't want to trade places because we'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And I also want to say that every part of our life should be shaped by a commitment to Jesus' kingdom. That's the goal. Whatever you do, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. And we want to be shaped to look like Him. How we think, how we talk, and how we act should be shaped by the fact that we are in Christ and that we are His disciples. And I just want you to ponder. I don't have all the answers to this, but I want you to think about the way that you live in those ways, how they could create opportunities for you at work and at school, in your family relationships, in your neighborhood, how you pursuing Christ-likeness, pursuing the blessings of being merciful and a peacemaker and hungering and thirsting for righteousness, how those activities and thoughts and concerns could make you with more opportunities, could shape you to have greater opportunities to share the gospel. So just think about a few sample areas, and I can't talk about every area in which we need to talk about this. These would be on the screen if I could figure out what was going on. But one sample area would be our attitude. I think that our attitude towards the way that things are going in our lives are going to impress one way or the other the people who are around us. I'm really struck by what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. Do all things without grumbling and disputing. In your job, in your activities, for example, at my job, bosses have been changing and people have been leaving and other people have been coming. And I'll tell you, one of the major things that I've heard is grumbling and disputing about all of that. And I have found myself being tempted in that direction. And one of the most important things, I think, in a moment like that is to not do anything with grumbling and disputing. And to be content and to be joyful and to do the work that's set before us and to do the best we can. Because I don't work for whoever the principal or superintendent is. I work for the Lord. And we need to keep that in mind. Also keep in mind in that same book, I was thinking about Philippians 2, but I also thought about Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, that be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. It doesn't specifically point us out as being an example in that, but I think it'll shine through if we're able to do things not with anxiety, but with thanksgiving as we make our requests known to God. Amen. Let me say that I think especially even in our world, I think that our language is going to be a major way, and our attitude is going to reflect itself in our language. I understand that. But if we will embrace having language that is distinctive, that's seasoned with salt, as Paul will actually say in Colossians chapter 4, if we will have language that shows that we are children of light and not of darkness, that's going to be a place where we're going to be different. And I think it's perfectly okay for people to see the difference, comment about the difference, and you embrace that, in fact, yes, there is a difference in my language and the rest of the world's language. And the reason that I want people to notice that is because I want God to get the glory for it. So in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3, he says, sexual immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you as is proper among saints, or filthiness or foolish talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. If the people around you don't hear the coarse jesting, but they hear the giving of thanks, that's going to leave an impression. If the people around you don't hear the gossip, but they hear what is fitting for a saint, that's going to make a difference. And there are other passages we could look at about language, but I think that's sufficient. Another area would be in our love and our service towards one another here. We need to be committed to one another in a special way. Jesus said this specifically in John chapter 13 and verse 13. Verse 34. John chapter 13 and verse 34. Jesus said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." If you want the world to know that you are my disciples, Jesus said, you have a special dedication, a special love for one another. How does he illustrate that? He washes their feet. He serves his disciples. And that is what he's pointing them to in this passage. I think that as we, as a group, as we work together, if we will show that we have a special devotion, a special dedication to one another, I think it'll shine to the community around us. I think that is a way that we can be a light to the world. I think that's the way right here together we can be a city that's set on a hill so that people give God the glory for what happens. Because our dedication to one another should supersede the concerns that our city has for itself or for our county or for our state. The love that we have for one another should even surpass the love that we would have for family. We do that together, and that love and that service for one another will shine as a light to the world. Well, I think that's enough. I was going to talk about our diligence in our work. I think that would be something. I think our kindness to people who we see are in need. I think all sorts of things would help us to shine as lights in the world. But you're thinking about that and how your character can be put on display. And so this week, let's think about that and how our character can be on display, recognizing that it will not always bring positive reactions, but that God can use it certainly to bring honor and glory to his name in the world. I don't know how you've been doing it, letting your light shine. I know how some of you have been doing it, letting your light shine, because I've been able to see it. But if you don't think that you've been letting your light shine in the middle of this crooked and perverse generation, and you want to think more about that, then perhaps one of the best places to start, I know the best place to start, is to pray to God to help you to see the places where you're not shining as brightly as you need to, and then trim your lamp and shine as a light in the world. If we can encourage you, if we can help you to be a light in the world, to be salt to the earth, then we want to help you and encourage you. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.